Hey everyone, welcome back. David in History for the Ages here. If you're new, please remember to subscribe, like. I love reading comments on my videos, so please share some comments. And this is a topic that's always been kind of one of my pet peeves when people talk about our political spectrum and they go, there's the left and there's the right. And you have communists on the left and Nazis on the right, and this kind of polar opposite sides of the political spectrum. And every time I see that, I'm thinking, what are you talking about? This is not the right way to look at it. So I want to kind of go over this, showing the traditional way the political spectrum is often described as. And I'm really curious, is this how you learned it? Did you not learn it this way? And then I'm going to show you how I like to talk about it with my students. And it's a very different approach in terms of understanding history and past politics and current events. So here we go. So this is what the way it often looks, right? Kind of this kind of rainbow shaped thing where you have the left and you have the right. And by the way, why is left left and right right? This is kind of a really cool little tangent, but it's an important part of this story here, which is it goes back to the French Revolution. So when you had the French Revolution, you had what we call the Legislative Assembly. Everybody who sat in there was in favor of the French Revolution, but there were people who sat in that Legislative Assembly, and some sat on the left side and some sat on the right side. And the ones who sat on the left side were the more radical ones. They wanted to, kill Louis, behead him, and all that. The ones who sat on the right side, they weren't happy with the King of France, Louis XVI. They wanted him out of power, but they didn't necessarily want him dead, right? And there were some other differences as well. And so the people who sat on the left were more radical. The people who sat on the right were more conservative. And that's why we think of right being quote unquote conservative and left being more and more quote unquote liberal, right? So that's where those terms come from. If you're wondering why left is left and right is right. So when we generally see it, we have the center, and this is how it's usually depicted. You go a little bit left, Democrats, a little bit right, Republican, further left, liberal, further right, conservative. Of course, these terms also change meanings over the years, right? If you look at 19th century liberalism, nothing to do with what a liberal is today, I think. Maybe not nothing, but very little to do with what liberalism is today. And then you go further left, you get to socialist, and you go far left, and you get to communist. And on the other side, you go far right, and eventually get to Nazis and fascists and all of that. The problem with this, and why I completely dislike this model, is because then you look at this and you go, okay, that means communism and fascism, Nazism on the opposite sides of the political spectrum. The problem is, in reality, they're the same thing, right? Now, of course, there are technical differences between communism and Nazism and fascism. And I have a video that breaks down what is fascism in 5 minutes. Definitely worth checking it out. And when I talk about the Bolshevik Revolution, I go through what is communism and Karl Marx and all that stuff. And so I break these ideas down for sure. However, what they share in common is so much more important. What they share in common is they are both authoritarian regimes controlling every aspect of your life. And that's why I don't like this model. And I prefer this. And this is how I think it's better explained. And I'm not saying this is the only way to think about it, right? I know, there are different approaches, and some people say this might be kind of oversimplified model because it doesn't capture everything. But I think it's much better when you're trying to kind of gauge and evaluate the sheer level of control government has over your life. So on one side, you have anarchy, right? Anarchy, no rulers, no law, chaos, right? Then you have along the political spectrum groups that want a little bit more government. So you have your libertarians, then you have what you would call conservatives, then you have Republicans, they want a little bit more government than conservatives. Then the Democrats want a little bit more, socialists want a bunch more, and then you get to the end and you have your communists, Nazis, fascists grouped together because they're all about, basically taking control of people's lives in a very kind of authoritarian manner. Now, I know some people are probably already screaming, wait a second, I know there are conservatives who want big government in some things, and liberals want small government in some things. Of course, right? Yes, you could find examples when there are conservatives who say, I do want government more involved in, certain elements of people's lives. And maybe you'll find a Democrat who says, no, in these areas I want less government. But if we're honest and we're being truthful, generally, people of the political, what we again quote unquote call left Democrats, they're the ones who want bigger government, things, more regulations, more control of our day-to-day lives. Again, the argument is it's better for society, whatever their belief system is. And conservatives generally believe smaller government better. What was that famous line from Ronald Reagan, right? Traditional conservative, where he says, funny line, he said, the scariest words anyone's ever heard is "I'm here from the government and I'm here to help you," right? Paraphrasing a bit there. But the idea of a big government is not something conservatives generally like. So this, I think, captures at least a little bit more reality than left and right, because it groups it more from limited government to extreme government. Now, there is another way of looking at it, which is sometimes called this quadrant method, right? Where you have authoritarian, libertarian, and then you have more left and conservative. But this also has a little bit of problems to it because, if you think of kind of social libertarian, right? What you would see on the bottom left. And you think, well, okay, they're libertarians. So by this idea, do they not want a lot of government? Well, they kind of do, right? Because they also want, social justice, redistribution of wealth. And that doesn't happen without bigger government involvement. And so, even this model, I will say I like this still better than that rainbow model. And so there's no one perfect way to, I think, look at the political spectrum. But I definitely think when we used what we usually see and most often seen is just kind of this left right. And on the left, you have communism, and on the right, you have Nazism, leaves a lot to be desired. So I wanted to share a couple different ways to look at it. If you want to learn more about kind of what is fascism, you can watch my video on fascism. I have a whole video on totalitarianism you could watch as well, a little bit longer. My fascism video is short, 5 minutes. Totalitarian is a long, detailed lecture my students watch, but I think it'll bring a lot of insight into a lot of this. So some things to think about. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Drop a comment, share the video. Thank you, everyone. I hope you found that interesting, and have a great day. Bye.